I was praying, I was thinking of the Greek word that we translate as the Comforter when Jesus is talking about the Holy Spirit. The Greek word is Parakletos, which is very close to the Spanish word. Spanish word is very close to that. But it literally means the one that comes alongside of. And when we think of the Spirit, that's the role the Spirit plays. Romans chapter 2, verses 21 through 23. Simply called this, practice what you preach. Practice what you preach. We're in the middle, once again, of this argument, if you will, that Paul is making. We're literally in mid-sentence. Verse 21, you therefore who teach another, do you not teach yourself? You who preach that one shall not steal, do you steal? You who say that one should not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You who abhor idols, do you rob temples? Okay, it's been about 3 weeks, I think, since we were in the book of Romans. So, since verse 17, Paul has been addressing the Jewish people. And this whole argument that he's been talking about is all addressed to the same audience. And what he's been talking about is what benefit was there in being a Jew, one of God's chosen people. What was the benefit of that? And that's where he's going with this entire thing. And he kind of answers that. He says, well, the benefits of being a Jew is you have the law. I mean, that's a major thing. You've got the law, and because you have the law, you can know the will of God, and you have discernment between that which is right and that which is wrong. You are able to be a teacher to those that are in darkness. You can correct the foolish. You can instruct. All of this because you have the law, and the law is the very embodiment of knowledge and truth. So there's great advantage to that. But the question is this: what value has it been to them? That's the question now that Paul is wanting to carry on. What value has it been to them? Now I want to insert something here. If you may not know this, I love books. It's a shock. I love to read. Therefore, one of my favorite quotes, and I have many, is this one. The person who does not read is no better off than the person who cannot read. The person who does not read is no better off than the person who cannot read. Let me put it this way. What are we doing with what we've got? That's the question. What are we doing with what we've got? Now here's that phrase, practice what you preach. In other words, what Paul says, and I think he would say to us, while we are busy teaching everyone else, enlightening them, graciously allowing others to be the grateful recipients of our wisdom, Paul says, take a look in the mirror. Take a look in the mirror. You notice I entitled today's message, Mirror Theology. Mirror Theology. To drive his point home, Paul chooses very common examples. 3 of them, as a matter of fact, and they're very simple to understand, by the way. Paul writes some things which are really hard to understand. Peter even said that. This isn't one of them. This is pretty simple stuff. These are not some finely nuanced activities with these very amplified shades of gray, which, well, we're probably going to have to find a good theologian to figure out what these mean. It's not the kind of thing that theologians like to argue well into the night about. Paul has chosen the most obvious examples of right and wrong that he possibly could choose. He says, while you are teaching, remember they have the law. Because of the law, they can be instructors and giving light to those in darkness and wisdom to the foolish and all those kinds of things. So Paul simply says this, while you're teaching, while you're out doing this, are you teaching yourself? Are you teaching yourself? Am I teaching myself? I'll repeat it again, one of my favorite pastoral cartoons is the pastor and his congregation's out here, and he's at the pulpit, and his head is down on the pulpit, and he's sound asleep. And he is sound asleep. And there's 2 people at the front, and one whispers to the other and says, you know, I think his problem was when he said whatever he preaches to us, he preaches to himself first. And in a sense, that's what Paul says. You're teaching, but are you teaching yourself? Are you hearing what you are saying? Here's his big ideas: stealing, committing adultery, and robbing temples. Now, I'm going to tell you something. I do not think that I have ever preached a sermon against stealing. Now, I've not preached one in favor of it either. But I've never preached a sermon against stealing. I'm trying to think back, and I really don't think I have. Now, one of the main reasons that I have never preached a sermon against stealing, because I think that is fairly obvious. I think that is something that people know, especially people that come into church, that you should not be doing. It's kind of clear, I think. But as the Jews would teach the law and the Ten Commandments, there it was right in front of them, and it was pretty clear. So what Paul says to the Jews, I think he would say this: so in this clear understanding that stealing is wrong, do we steal? Most of us aren't guilty, I don't think, of armed robbery, breaking and entering, or even, like, they heard the story about the recent thing where a young man went and siphoned some gas from a police car. Had his girlfriend take a picture, and then he put it on Facebook. That's a true story, by the way. But you know, when we think of things like that, are those the only ways that we can steal? Are we guilty of taking those things that are not rightfully ours? Kind of think through the ramifications of that one. Adultery. Now, I'm going to work from the assumption that nobody is sitting here that's involved in an adulterous affair. Now, I said that's a presumption. If you are, may God convict you of your sin in powerful, powerful ways. However, Christian marriage counselor Norman Wright described an affair like this: whenever you take the time and energy that rightfully belongs to your spouse and invest it elsewhere. Is that interesting? Whenever you take the time and energy that rightfully belongs to your spouse and invest it elsewhere. He goes to this third one. You know, was there anything as bad in the mind of the Jew as idolatry? I mean, you go throughout the entire Old Testament history, the Jewish people, they suffered tremendously because of idolatry. They understood the seriousness of idolatry. So, of course, they would rail against the evils of idol worship, especially the idol worship that was taking place among the Gentiles, right? They really were good at railing against that. And they came down against that really hard. Interestingly enough, though, the scholars give a couple of possibilities of what might be meant by Paul's use of robbing temples. And here they are. Listen to this first one. Did it mean to physically go into the pagan temples of the Gentiles and steal the valuables that they might find there? That's a possibility, robbing temples, right? Go ahead and just steal those valuable things. Or, number two, did it mean to live in such a way as to bring dishonor to God and thereby rob the temple of its glory? Interesting thought, isn't it? Verse 23 gives us quite a hint. We read that, "You who boast in the law, through your breaking the law, do you dishonor God?" They boasted in the law. They boasted of having the law. They boasted of being people of the law. So what happened? When they broke the law, did they dishonor the law? No. When they broke the law, they dishonored God. Number two, blasphemy. Verse 24, single verse here. "For the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you." The name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. This is actually a quote from Isaiah chapter 52, verse 5. That's where it comes from, out of the Old Testament, Listen to what a commentator by the name of John Murray said about this verse. Very, very powerful stuff. Listen. The reasoning of the Gentiles is to the effect that a people are like their God. And if the people can perpetrate such crimes, their God must be of the same character. The tragic irony is apparent. The Jews who claimed to be the leaders of the nations for the worship of the true God had become the instruments of provoking the nations to blasphemy. Here's God's chosen people, should have been the ones drawing people to worship God. They, in fact, lived in such a way that the people blasphemed God. See how juxtaposed these ideas have become. Having the law, the Jews see themselves as bringing the light of who God is to the Gentiles. And Paul says nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, they have provided the very tools to blaspheme the name of God. If you, and maybe you do, maybe you've heard it, the myriad of people that had an experience of faith or grew up in church or in some way connected to Christianity and then turn away from the faith, and if you ask them, so often this is one of the reasons that will be given. Because of how they saw Christians act. How they saw Christians live. It was Gandhi who said, I like your Christ. I do not like your Christians. They are nothing like your Christ. Now you can decide whether he was telling the truth or not. Because the fact is, we can live in such a way that shows the attractiveness of Christ, or we can live in such a way to drive people away from him. It's just that simple. Or as I like to say, the gospel of the cross is offensive. The messenger should not be. Number 3. Begin with verse 25. For indeed circumcision is of value if you practice the law. But if you are a transgressor of the law, your circumcision has become uncircumcision. So if the uncircumcised man keeps the requirements of the law, will not his uncircumcision be regarded as circumcision? And he who is physically uncircumcised, if he keeps the law, will he not judge you, who though having the letter of the law and circumcision are a transgressor of the law? For if he is not a Jew who is one outwardly, nor is circumcision that is which is outward in the flesh, but he is a Jew who is one inwardly, and circumcision is that which is of the heart, by the Spirit, not by the letter, and his praise is not from men, but from God. Okay, got it? I've got to tell you, though, I love what I chose to call my last point. If you look in the bulletin, you'll see. Why are we talking about that? I thought that was a pretty good title for the third point. This is a very radical passage of Scripture, and not because of the use of the C word. That's not what makes us radical. What makes us radical is where Paul ends up at. And this is extremely radical for his audiences, that I would love to see the look on their face as they read what Paul writes here. Now, we need to state the obvious, I guess, and if it's not obvious, then I'm not stating the obvious, clearly. But I think most of us are aware that in the biblical setting, circumcision, now I'm talking about physical circumcision, was not the common practice that it is today. It just was not. It was not what standardly happened. It was specifically, when we go back in the first century, actually well before the first century, we start with Abraham, obviously, this was an external sign done among the Jewish people as a physical sign that they were the covenant people of God. Now we say, why in the world that seems strange? Well, actually in the Hebrew, the word that is used to make covenant literally is to cut covenant. Now you may go, ooh, didn't need to say that. That's the way it is, okay? So this literally was an external sign of somebody who was among the covenant people of God. And that's exactly what it meant. That's exactly how it's to be understood. So, that being the case, when we read this passage, when we read the word circumcision, think Jew. When we read the word uncircumcision, think Gentile. Because that's exactly what Paul is doing, and that's the way this is meant to be understood. Now, when we read verses 25 through 27, we just read all the way to 29. But if you read verses 25 to 27, let me give you the condensed version. Here's what Paul is saying. If the external sign of covenant, that is circumcision, if the external sign of covenant does not line up with a covenant heart, then the external sign is meaningless. If the external sign of covenant does not line up with an internal covenant heart, then the external sign might as well not even be there. It's kind of like whenever I do a baptismal service, you will hear me say this. I will say, what we are doing is simply an external, an outward expression of what has happened in somebody's life. And the fact is, if you're not a believer, here's what happens. You go into the water a dry sinner and you come out a wet sinner. Because there's nothing in the act of baptism itself that has changed anybody other than getting them wet. That's kind of what Paul is saying here. If the external sign doesn't line up with what's happening internally, then the external sign doesn't matter. That's where Paul's going. Let me put it this way. Here's another way of thinking about it. If the physical Jew does not keep the law, it is as if he has become a Gentile. Now try to imagine a first century Jew hearing this. If a physical Jew does not keep the law, it is as if he has become a Gentile. And if a Gentile keeps the law, it's as if he has become a Jew. Fascinating. In fact, Paul says that Gentile will sit in a place of authority over that Jew. Now, this idea is going to be totally unacceptable to the Jewish mind. How many of you remember the scene in the synagogue in Capernaum? Remember when Jesus stands up and he reads from Isaiah? The Spirit of the Lord is upon you, is anointed me. Remember that whole scene? And remember that after he reads it, he says, this now has been fulfilled in your hearing. You remember that? And remember the people freak out and rise up and going to throw him and kill him and throw him off the cliff and they can't. And remember that whole scene? Well, a lot of times we hear that scene, we miss something. Because the problem was not that Jesus said, this has been fulfilled in your hearing. Because we go to one of the other Gospels, what we find out is this. Jesus gives a couple of examples in the Old Testament of places where God, instead of working among the Jewish people, used a Gentile. That is when the people go nuts and rush him to kill him. Because that idea was anathema. There is no way that would happen. So when Paul writes what he writes here, this is completely unacceptable to the Jewish mind. Remember, in the temple, you had the outer court, and there's that little 6-inch barricade, this tiny little wall that separated the court of the Gentiles from the rest of the temple. And there's a sign that said, if a Gentile were to cross that, he would do so upon penalty of death. Okay, so understand this setting when Paul writes this, that actually a covenant child of God in disobedience to the law would be as if he were a Gentile. And obedience would cause the Gentile to be as if he were a Jew. It's incredibly radical. But the thing is, Paul is about to go a whole lot farther than that. Verse 28. For he is not a Jew who is one outwardly, nor is circumcision that which is outward in the flesh. Do you see what Paul just said? I mean, what just said is absolutely amazing. Being a Jew, Paul says, is not about ethnicity. Being a Jew is not about where you were born, he says. Being a Jew is not about who your parents are. Being a Jew is not about any of those things, is what Paul has just said. And it is not about an external sign like circumcision, he tells them, which Jews would be the only people in that era of the world that understood that as an external sign. Nobody else did. Paul says this is what being a Jew is about. It is not one who is one outwardly. It is not one who has this parentage. It is not one who has circumcision. He is a Jew who is one inwardly. And circumcision, Paul now says, is not an external sign. Paul says it's an internal sign. It's an internal reality. So when the Jews are saying, what are you talking about? This is what being a Jew is all about. Paul says, oh no, not anymore. The paradigm is changing. Jesus has changed the paradigm. Jewishness is inward, not outward. Circumcision is of the heart. Listen, it is by the Spirit and not by the letter. In other words, what it really means to be among the people of God is accomplished by the Spirit of God, not by the deadness of the law. In other words, God is about something brand new here. In fact, notice how this chapter ends. And his praise is not from men, but from God. This passage began in verse 16. And in verse 16, the person bearing the name Jew and having all these benefits had to do with things which were external. That's where Paul started at in verse 16. But Paul says that this Jew, that is the true Jew, that is the real Jew, the one that he's describing at the end, does not receive his praise through any human title or achievement or any of those kinds of things, what he may possess, none of those things. Any true worth, now hear this because he says it to us, any true worth comes from God and the things of God, therefore the praise goes to God. It's all about what God has done. I had to chuckle on last Sunday, a week ago. I don't know. In the last hour, I had the opportunity to sit and listen to Mayor Michael Bloomberg speak. One of the highlights of my life. Well, Mayor Bloomberg is speaking. And as he's speaking, he was using as examples all the things that he had done and that he had accomplished and what had happened in his life. And he did. He was going, and I turned to Clayton and I said, listen to this guy. This is absolutely amazing. And I literally turned to Clayton and I'm bringing her attention to what has been going on, at which point I turned back around, and as I turned back around, I hear the mayor say, and we need to stop using these words, I and me, all the time. It's about us and them. And I got a chuckle out of it, and I did. I laughed out loud, I think. But in a sense, that's kind of where Paul is ending this up. For the Jews, you think it's all about what you have. You think it's all about externalities. You think it's about possession. You think it's about reputation. And Paul says, no, that's deadness. That's an old paradigm. That is not even what it means to be one of the covenant chosen people of God anymore. Because it is not about the deadness of the law. It is what the Spirit of God has done in somebody's life. And the praise will never come from men, Paul says. The praise will always come from God. You stand with